We're going to talk about real numbers and operations. We've talked a little bit about absolute value, and we know that absolute value is the distance from zero. It's always positive, and when we see it, we treat it like brackets. So our first example, A, we have absolute value of negative 17 minus 2. Those are both inside the absolute value, so we have to treat them like brackets, and just like brackets or parentheses, we do that operation first. So this is just an integer operation. So we have a negative 17 minus 2. We can look at it as a negative 17 and a negative 2. If you want to do the cha-ching or keep, change, that works for you, you may. Negative 17 and negative 2 are the same value as far as sign, so we know they're the same. So we're going to combine those numbers and keep the sign. So I'm going to rewrite, keeping my absolute value, because I'm just simplifying inside. So I have a negative 19. And then when I look and say, okay, well, the absolute value of 19 and a negative inside, we know that's going to come out as a positive. That's going to give us the value of 19. All right, let's look at B. So this one we have a negative on the outside of the absolute value symbols. So that has to be applied after. We still look at inside first and treat it like brackets. We have a negative 3 and a positive 2. They are different signs, so we find the difference. So the difference between 3 and 2 is 1. And we keep the sign of the one that goes with a larger value. So 3 is bigger than 2, so we keep it as a negative 1. Keep them absolute value, bring down your negative. So the absolute value of negative 1 is 1, and then we apply the negative. So our answer is negative 1. If we look at C, we have an absolute value of a variable, a minus a plus a. And we're going to evaluate it if we are told that a is negative 2. Now it's very important when you're evaluating to make sure you use everything they give you to evaluate. Don't just put 2 in there. Make sure you're putting in the negative 2. I like to use parentheses. So I'm going to rewrite my problem with my value in there. So I'm going to plug in negative 2 where a is. So negative 2 minus is part of the problem right now. So then I'm going to plug in another a value, which is negative 2, and then close my absolute value, plus a negative 2. So when I simplify first inside, I have a negative 2 minus a negative 2. I know that together, the two negatives here, if we keep, change, or cha-ching, this turns into a positive. So what we have here is the absolute value of negative 2 plus 2, and then plus a negative 2. So we've simplified one step down. Now inside the parentheses, a negative 2 plus 2, those are opposite signs, and they're opposite of each other, so we know that's going to give us 0. When 0 comes out as a value, it has no sign, it's just 0. So we have 0 plus a negative 2, so we know our answer is negative 2. Now, I've written the calculator way that you get there, but we'll talk about the calculator at the end of the video for each option that we've done to show you how that works. But to get to the absolute value on your calculator, you hit your math button, which is right under the alpha button. And if you have the TI-84 downloaded on your MacBook, it's the same way. And then if you have the TI-83, it'll work as well. There are some functions that don't work on our next step for a TI-83, but the TI-84, it's the math button, and then you'll go to the menu, it'll pop up, and you'll go to number, which you'll have to scroll over 1, and then option 1, and then enter, and we'll show you that on the calculator shortly. All right, so our next section is about mixed numbers and fractions. So some key things that you have to remember is you have to always change mixed numbers to improper fractions when working with them. It's the easiest, it's less mistakes are done that way, so change those mixed numbers so they're all improper fractions. It's easier to work with improper fractions in Math 1 and beyond than it is to work with mixed numbers. And even better to work with fractions than it is decimals. Remember, when you add or subtract fractions, they must have the same denominator. They have to have like denominators to add or subtract. And before you multiply or divide, it's best to always simplify. So let's look at option 1 here, example 1. So we have 3/5 plus 2 1/2. So one of our main rules is we're going to change that mixed number first into an improper. Remember, to do that, we take our denominator times our whole number, so 2 times 2 is 4, and then add our top number, and it goes all over our denominator. So 3/5 can stay. We didn't do anything to it. We're just rewriting the problem with our mixed number changed to improper. So 2 times 2 is 4, plus 1 is 5, and that goes all over 2. Well, now we've got them both into fraction form, and we've got to now look at what we're doing. We're adding. We do not have the same denominator, so we've got to get the same denominators. So you got to think, what can they both go into? Well, 2 can't go into 5, and 5 can't go into 2, but they have something that's common that they can go into, so we got to find what that common is. Well, an easy way, if you're not really sure, you can multiply those. Sometimes you get a bigger number than you need, but in this case, it actually is the smallest common denominator. So we're going to use 10 for both of them. So we're going to change the denominators to 10. So we ask ourselves, 5 times what gets us 10? Well, that's 2. So if we times this by 2, we have to times this by 2. So 3 times 2 is 6. 2 times what gets us 10? Well, that's 5. So 2 times 5 at the bottom, and we have to do at the top. So we have 25 over 10. Now we have them as the same denominator, like denominators, and we can now add them. When we're adding, the denominator stays, and we add across the top. So 25 plus 6 is 31. Now, we can leave this in improper form. It's nice to simplify it down if we can, but still leave it in improper form. This, however, cannot be simplified further down into fraction form and improper state. We could change it back to a mixed number. I would avoid that unless they're asking you a very specific question that you need to do that, and you'll see that as we practice. This could be written as how many times can 10 go into 30? Well, it can go 3 whole times with 1 left over. So 3 1/10 is the same thing as 31/10. All right, let's go to our next one. Number B. We have 6 3/7 minus 2 1/3. First thing we do is change our mixed numbers into improper fractions. So 6 times 7, 42, plus 3 is 45 sevenths. 2 times 3 is 6, plus 1 is 7 thirds. Now, we've got to find common denominators. Again, if you're not really sure what the lowest common denominator would be for 7 and 3, or lowest common multiple, you would multiply these together. In this case, it actually works. So we're going to change this to 21. 7 will go into 21 3 times, so we know we did 7 times 3. So 45 times 3 is actually 135. And we're going to change this one as well to the common denominator 21. So 3 times 7 gives us 21, so 7 times 7 is 49. Now we just do our subtraction. So 135 minus 49 gives us 86. Denominator stays the same. If we can simplify that down and make it a simplified fraction, even in improper form, we should do that. If not, we can change it if we need to a mixed number. So there is a way that I'm going to show you on your calculator to simplify fractions and how to actually even put fractions in. And students really enjoy this feature. It will actually put it in for you and simplify it if it's able to be simplified. Desmos also does this with our calculator, and so we'll talk about that later as well. Now, if we wanted to change this to a mixed number, this is the same thing as saying 4 and 2 over 21. So either of those at this point would be correct, but try to get away from going back to mixed numbers. All right, so example C. We have 12/15 times 6/8. We are wanting to always think about simplifying before we multiply or divide, if we can. So when we look here, we can simply multiply across. We're going to get some very big numbers, which means we're going to have to then simplify down, probably quite a bit. So if we look at the opposites here and here, and we say, is there anything that can go into 12 and 8? Well, I know 2 can, 4 can. We want to pick the biggest number that we possibly can. So 4 can go into 12 3 times, and 4 can go into 8 2 times. So I'm cross-reducing. I can look at 15 and 6 and say, what can go into both of those? Well, I know that 3 can go into both of those. 3 can go into 6 2 times, and 3 can go into 15 5 times. So now what I have is 3/5 times 2 over 2. And if we think about what 2 over 2 is, it's 1. So we're just saying 1 times 3/5. So we know our answer is going to get 3/5. If we don't see that first, we can multiply straight across. We get 6/10. And then we say, well, we can reduce that, and we get 3/5. So you could have got there a little quicker. All right, let's go to our next problem, and then we'll talk about calculator. So here's a problem with a mixed number, and it's being divided by a whole number. So the first thing we're going to do is change it to an improper fraction. So 3 times 4 is 12, plus 1 will give us 13 over 4, and this is being divided by 4. Now remember, when we divide anything by a whole number, we can think about it as a fraction as well. We can put any whole number over 1 and make it look like a fraction. Doesn't change the value. So when we divide, we're actually going to keep the first fraction. We're going to change the sign. So we're going to change division to multiplication. It's inverse. And we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. So remember that word, reciprocal. So we have actually 13/4 times 1/4. Now, if we look and say, okay, can we cross reduce? Well, 13 and 4, there's nothing that can go in there, either one of those together, the same thing that can make them smaller, so they have to stay. And 4 and 1, they're as small as they can go. So now we just multiply straight across. 13 times 1 is 13, and 4 times 4 is 16. Then look to see if you can reduce any further. This one you cannot. So that would be your final answer. Now on the calculator, to get to the shortcut feature of fractions and fractions to change to decimals and mixed numbers to improper, is alpha y equals. The alpha button is the green button, and the y equals is the first button at the top near your screen. It also says stat plot right above it. So we're going to talk about how to use those features. All right, so I'm going to turn my camera on so you can see, and we'll go back to using absolute value first, and we'll do one of our problems. So, kind of got a little setup here so hopefully you can see my calculator pretty well. So we're going to go back to using the absolute value, and this one on your calculator, the one you download from FileWave, will also work. It's a little bit more cumbersome to click the buttons with the mouse, but you guys will adjust. And then we'll talk later about how to do this in Desmos as well. So when we look at our very first problem, it was an absolute value. It was the absolute value of -17 minus 2. So to get to absolute value, remember we go to Math. So here's your Math button. This menu comes up. You do have a fraction in here as well. It's another way to get to a fraction. And then these buttons here go over and up. So if I want to go down or up, I go here. If I want to go over, I use these back and forth. So I want to go to the numbers, and it's my very first option, number 1. This is ABS, and it has a parentheses. Doesn't look like the absolute value bars yet, but when you click enter on your calculator, it comes up with the bars and a flashing cursor inside the bars. That's where you're going to put your values. So when we're putting in negative numbers, do not use the subtraction. Use the little negative button that's under the 3. So we're going to do a negative. I'll move it back up so you can see. 17 and minus, because we're subtracting, minus 2. And to get out of the absolute value, you're going to use your cursor and go over. And you're going to hit enter. And it gives you the answer immediately. So I want you to know how to do it on your own, but the calculator is a great resource and a tool, especially when you're doing large amounts once you understand the concepts. All right, so now let's move on to using the alpha y feature, or the fraction shortcut. Now the older calculators do not have this, and I'm not sure if they've updated the one that you download on your computer to have this, but the TI-84 and 84 Pluses, they do have this. And a lot of them can be updated. So if yours does not have it, we can look and see if we can update it. So, or the software we can update. So when you want to put in a fraction, there's a couple ways. If you don't have this option that I'm going to show you the shortcut, you can still put a fraction in with parentheses and using division. Remember, fractions are just division. So let's say I wanted to put in 3/5. So our first problem was 3/5 plus 2.5. So we already changed the 2.5 to an improper. So 3 divided by 5, and we can close that parentheses. That's putting in a fraction. Doesn't look like we normally write it on top of each other, but it's still a fraction. And then we can add, and then put our other parentheses in. as 5 divided by 2. We change that to improper. And then we hit enter, and we get 3.1. Now, you've got to know that that's 3 1/10, which we changed to improper, and what that would do to change it back to a fraction. So let's talk about the shortcut. It's a little bit easier, especially when you get decimals instead of having to change it back. So we go to the alpha and the y equals. So it's the button right here. Y equals is very light in white. And it brings up a menu. And there's tons of functions. We're going to stay on this first one. The number 1, it says n over d. That means numerator over denominator. That's just putting in a regular fraction. Number 2 is if you want to put in a mixed number. So it has a big U and then n over d. And then number 3 is changing a fraction to a mixed number. And number 4 is changing a fraction to a decimal, or vice versa. So we're going to first put in our fraction. We're going to put in our problem just the way we had it. So we're going to put it in as 3. You've got to use your little buttons to go down. 5, and move over. And we did plus. And now we're going to put in the mixed number we had originally. So back to alpha, y equals. We're going to go down to option 2. Now you can scroll down or you can click 2. And then it shows up as a mixed number format or template. So we're going to do 2, go over, and 1/2. And when we hit enter, it automatically put the brackets for us. It's 31/10. Now, if we want to change that to a decimal, we can go back into our alpha, y equals. We can go down to fraction to decimal, hit enter. It takes our answer that we just had, which is 31/10, and changes it from a fraction to a decimal. We hit enter, and it's changed it to a decimal. If we want to change it to a mixed number, alpha, y equals, we can go down to fraction to mixed number. Now, I've got it in as a decimal, so I'm going to change it back first to a decimal, and then I'm going to change it to a mixed number. And it will do it for us. So it's a lot of things that it will work and do for you. Practice with it. Remember, don't get so stuck in the little shortcuts that you forget what you're doing, but these are great resources to use. So hopefully this helps you.